Kurt Cobain's handwriting expert, made a terrifying discovery when forensic handwriting analyst Marcel Matley was contacted by Kurt Cobain's family in 2002 to examine personal letters and documents from Kurt's final months. He expected a routine analysis. What he discovered would shake his understanding of the troubled grunge icon and reveal disturbing patterns in Kurt's handwriting that told a story of a man in the final stages of psychological collapse. But Matley's analysis uncovered something even more chilling than anyone expected. Hidden in Kurt's own words were signs that he had been planning something catastrophic for months. The evidence was right there in his handwriting, waiting for someone with the expertise to decode the psychological breakdown documented in ink. What Marcel Matley found in those documents would change everything we thought we knew about Kurt Cobain's final days. And it all started with a single letter that Kurt wrote to his wife Courtney just 3 weeks before his death. It was a cold February morning in 2002 when Marcel Matley received an unexpected phone call at his San Francisco office. Matley was one of America's most respected forensic document examiners. With over 40 years of experience analyzing handwriting for criminal investigations, disputed wills, and historical document authentication, the caller identified herself as Kim Cobain, Kurt's sister. She explained that the family had been going through Kurt's personal effects 8 years after his death and had discovered boxes of letters, journal entries, and notes that had never been thoroughly examined. "We want to understand what Kurt was going through in his final months," Kim explained to Matley, her voice breaking slightly. "We have all these writings, but we don't know what they mean. We've heard that handwriting can reveal things about a person's mental state. Can you help us?" Matley had worked on celebrity cases before, but nothing quite like this. The Kurt Cobain case was still controversial, with some people questioning whether his death had really been suicide. Matley agreed to examine the documents, but only on the condition that his analysis would focus purely on the handwriting characteristics and what they revealed about Kurt's psychological state. 3 days later, a package arrived at Matley's office, containing photocopies of dozens of documents written by Kurt between January and April 1994. There were letters to Courtney, journal entries, song lyrics, and even grocery lists, all written in Kurt's distinctive angular handwriting. Matley spread the documents across his examination table and began what would become the most disturbing handwriting analysis of his career. What he saw immediately concerned him. Even to the untrained eye, Kurt's handwriting showed dramatic changes over the 3-month period before his death. The earliest documents, from January 1994, showed Kurt's typical handwriting style, slightly messy, but controlled, with consistent letter sizes and spacing. But as Matley progressed through the chronological sequence, he watched Kurt's handwriting deteriorate in real time. "I've seen handwriting changes that indicate stress, illness, or substance abuse," Matley later explained to Kim Cobain during their follow-up meeting. "But I'd never seen anything quite like what happened to Kurt's writing in those final months. It was like watching someone's mind unravel on paper." The first document that caught Matley's attention was a letter Kurt had written to Courtney on February 14, 1994, Valentine's Day. The letter started normally enough, with Kurt expressing his love for his wife and daughter Frances. But halfway through the letter, something changed. The handwriting became more erratic. Letters started slanting in different directions. The pressure of Kurt's pen on the paper increased dramatically, sometimes tearing through to the other side. Most disturbing of all, Kurt began writing certain words multiple times, as if he couldn't remember that he'd already written them. "My beautiful wife," Kurt had written at the beginning of the letter in his normal handwriting. But further down, the same phrase appeared 3 more times, each instance more agitated than the last. The final repetition was written with such force that it had torn completely through the paper, leaving jagged holes where the pen had pressed too hard. Matley had seen this type of repetitive writing before, but only in cases involving severe psychological distress or neurological damage. It was a sign that Kurt's mind was not functioning normally when he wrote the letter. The repetition suggested obsessive thinking patterns, while the increasing pressure indicated rising anxiety and agitation. But the Valentine's Day letter was just the beginning. As Matley examined documents from March 1994, he discovered even more alarming changes in Kurt's handwriting. The letter sizes became increasingly inconsistent. Some words were written so small they were barely legible, while others were huge and sprawling, taking up entire lines. Most concerning was what forensic handwriting experts call disintegration, the breakdown of normal letter formation. Kurt's normally recognizable letters began to look distorted and primitive, almost like the handwriting of someone who was relearning to write after a severe injury. This type of handwriting disintegration typically indicates severe psychological distress, drug-induced impairment, or neurological damage, Matley noted in his preliminary analysis. In Kurt's case, it was likely a combination of all three factors working together to break down his motor control and cognitive function. One particular journal entry from March 15, 1994, stopped Matley cold. Kurt had attempted to write what appeared to be song lyrics, but the handwriting was so deteriorated that most of it was illegible. The few words that could be made out painted a disturbing picture: "Can't think," "head splitting," "make it stop," and "everything hurts." But what truly alarmed Matley was how the entry ended. Kurt had written the word goodbye 17 times, each repetition becoming more frantic and illegible than the last. The first few attempts were recognizable, but by the 10th repetition, the letters were starting to break apart. The final few attempts at the word were just scribbled lines that bore no resemblance to actual letters. This was not the handwriting of someone who was thinking clearly, Matley observed as he showed the document to Kurt Cobain. This was the handwriting of someone in the midst of a severe psychological crisis. The repetition of goodbye suggested that Kurt was mentally rehearsing his death, practicing the concept of leaving. Matley's analysis revealed that Kurt's handwriting problems weren't just random deterioration. There were specific patterns that suggested different types of distress. Some documents showed signs of what experts call tremor handwriting, shaky, unsteady letter formation that typically indicates physical withdrawal from drugs or extreme anxiety. Other documents showed signs of pressure variation, dramatic changes in how hard Kurt was pressing the pen against the paper. This type of writing often indicates emotional volatility and loss of motor control. Kurt would start a sentence with light, barely visible strokes, then suddenly press so hard that the pen would tear through the paper. Perhaps most disturbing were the documents that showed micro-writing, letters that became progressively smaller until they were barely visible. This type of handwriting change is often seen in cases of severe depression and feelings of worthlessness. It's as if the writer is literally trying to disappear on the page. Kurt's handwriting was telling the story of his mental state better than any diary entry could, Matley explained to the family. Each document was like a snapshot of his psychological condition at that moment, and the picture was getting darker with each passing week. One letter that particularly concerned Matley was written to Kurt's childhood friend Jesse Reed on March 25, 1994. Just 2 weeks before Kurt's death. The letter started with Kurt's normal handwriting as he reminisced about their childhood in Aberdeen. But the writing quickly deteriorated into something almost unrecognizable. Kurt had been trying to write about his memories of growing up in Aberdeen, describing fishing trips and teenage pranks. But as the letter progressed, the handwriting became increasingly erratic. Letters started floating above and below the baseline. Words began running together without spaces. By the end of the letter, Kurt was writing in circles rather than straight lines, and many of the words were written on top of each other, creating an illegible mess. This type of spatial disorganization in handwriting often indicates severe confusion and disorientation, Matley noted. Kurt was clearly struggling to organize his thoughts coherently enough to put them on paper. His brain was having difficulty with basic cognitive functions like spatial awareness and sequential thinking. But Matley's most chilling discovery came when he analyzed Kurt's final known piece of writing, a note found in his wallet after his death. The note contained only a few words. "Do you remember me?" written over and over again. in increasingly desperate handwriting. The handwriting analysis showed that Kurt had written this note multiple times, each attempt showing more deterioration than the last. The first version was somewhat legible, written in Kurt's recognizable style, but each subsequent attempt became more frantic and illegible. The final version was barely readable, with letters that looked more like desperate scratches than actual writing. This note suggested that Kurt was experiencing severe dissociation and memory problems in his final days. Matley concluded. He seemed to be losing his sense of identity and connection to the world around him. The question, "Do you remember me?" suggested that he was questioning his own existence and significance. Matley's analysis also revealed evidence of what forensic experts call death preparation in handwriting. In Kurt's case, this manifested as increasingly simplified letter formations and a tendency to write final statements or conclusions at the end of documents, even when the content didn't warrant such finality. Several of Kurt's final letters ended with phrases like, "That's all," "the end," or "goodbye forever," even when the content of the letter was mundane or routine. This type of conclusive language in handwriting often indicates that the writer is psychologically preparing for death. Kurt's handwriting suggested that he had been mentally preparing for his death for weeks, possibly months, before it actually occurred, Matley observed. The psychological preparation was evident in how he structured and concluded his writing, as if he was saying goodbye with every document he created. One of the most disturbing aspects of Matley's analysis was the evidence of what he called handwriting splitting. In several documents from Kurt's final weeks, his normal handwriting would suddenly change mid-sentence to a completely different style, as if another personality had taken over the pen. In one journal entry from early April 1994, Kurt had been writing normally about his plans for Nirvana's next album, discussing song ideas and recording schedules. But suddenly, mid-sentence, the handwriting changed completely. The new handwriting was more childlike and desperate, writing things like "help me" and "I'm scared" over and over again in the margins and between lines. This type of handwriting splitting often indicates severe psychological fragmentation. Matley explained to the family. Kurt seemed to be experiencing different states of consciousness that manifested in completely different handwriting styles. It was as if different parts of his psyche were taking turns controlling the pen. The childlike handwriting that appeared in these episodes was particularly concerning. It resembled the writing of a young child, with oversized letters and shaky formation. This suggested that Kurt was regressing to an earlier psychological state, possibly reliving childhood trauma or accessing primitive emotional states. Matley also discovered evidence that Kurt had been writing letters that he never intended to send. Several drafts of letters to friends and family members were found among his papers, but they showed signs of being written as a form of psychological release, rather than actual communication. These therapeutic letters showed some of Kurt's most deteriorated handwriting, suggesting that he was using writing as a way to express thoughts and feelings that were too disturbing to share with others. In these private writings, Kurt's handwriting became almost illegible, as if his mind was pouring out faster than his hand could follow. Kurt was clearly struggling with thoughts and emotions that he couldn't verbalize to the people around him, Matley noted. His handwriting became a form of secret communication with himself, a way to express the inexpressible. One particularly disturbing discovery was a series of letters Kurt had written to his deceased grandfather, Leland Cobain, who had died in The letters, dated from February through April 1994, showed Kurt's handwriting at its most deteriorated. In these letters, Kurt wrote about feeling lost and wanting to join his grandfather. He described feeling like he didn't belong in the world and questioned whether anyone would miss him if he was gone. The handwriting was so shaky and disorganized that it was difficult to read, but the emotional content was clearly that of someone in severe psychological distress. Writing to deceased relatives is not uncommon among people who are contemplating suicide, Matley observed. Kurt seemed to be reaching out to his grandfather as a way of psychologically preparing for his own death. The deteriorated handwriting in these letters suggested that Kurt was in an extremely fragile mental state when he wrote them. Matley's analysis also revealed that Kurt's drug use was clearly affecting his handwriting in specific, measurable ways. Documents written during periods of heavy drug use showed characteristic signs of impairment, including shaky letter formation, poor spacing, and inability to write in straight lines. But more concerning were the documents that showed signs of withdrawal. Kurt's handwriting during periods when he was trying to get clean was often more erratic than when he was using drugs, suggesting that the withdrawal process was causing severe psychological distress and physical symptoms that affected his motor control. Kurt's handwriting showed a pattern of deterioration that was accelerating in his final weeks. Matley concluded, whether due to drug use, withdrawal, or underlying mental illness, his ability to function normally was clearly compromised. The handwriting evidence suggested that he was in no condition to make rational decisions about his future. One of Matley's most significant findings was the analysis of Kurt's famous suicide note. While the content of the note had been analyzed extensively by psychologists and investigators, no one had previously conducted a detailed handwriting analysis to determine Kurt's mental state when he wrote it. Matley's examination revealed that the suicide note showed all of the handwriting characteristics that had been developing in Kurt's writing over the previous months. The deteriorated letter formation, the pressure variations, and the spatial disorganization were all present in the final note. The suicide note was consistent with the pattern of handwriting deterioration I had observed in Kurt's other writings from that period, Matley noted. It was clearly written by someone in severe psychological distress. The handwriting alone was evidence of Kurt's compromised mental state. But Matley also made another disturbing discovery about the suicide note. The handwriting showed signs of what experts call execution pressure, the type of writing that occurs when someone is forcing themselves to complete a difficult task against their natural inclinations. Kurt's handwriting in the suicide note suggested that writing it was extremely difficult for him. Matley explained, he was forcing himself to complete the note, despite severe psychological resistance. You can see it in the way certain words are written, with excessive force, as if he was fighting against his own hand. The note also showed evidence of multiple false starts and erasures, suggesting that Kurt had struggled with what to say and how to say it. Several words had been written over and corrected, and there were places where Kurt had pressed so hard with an eraser that he had damaged the paper. Matley's complete analysis painted a picture of a man whose mental state had been deteriorating for months before his death. The handwriting evidence suggested that Kurt had been struggling with severe depression, drug-induced impairment, and possible neurological problems that had been getting progressively worse. Kurt's handwriting told the story of someone who was losing his battle with his inner demons, Matley concluded in his final report. The deterioration was so severe and so consistent that his death seemed almost inevitable by the time he wrote his final note. This was not a sudden decision, but the culmination of months of psychological decline. The analysis also revealed that Kurt's artistic process had been affected by his deteriorating mental state. Song lyrics written in his final months showed the same handwriting problems as his personal letters, suggesting that his creative abilities were being compromised by his psychological condition. In one set of lyrics dated March 30, 1994, just over a week before his death, Kurt had attempted to write what appeared to be a love song, but the handwriting was so erratic and the words so disorganized that it was impossible to determine what the song was supposed to be about. Kurt's artistic voice was being silenced by his mental illness, Matley observed. The handwriting evidence suggests that he was losing the ability to express himself coherently, even through music, which had always been his primary form of communication. The family was devastated by Matley's findings, but they also felt that the analysis provided important insights into Kurt's final months. For the first time, they had objective evidence of just how severely Kurt had been suffering in his final weeks. We always knew Kurt was struggling, but Marcel's analysis showed us just how bad it really was, Kurt Cobain later said. His handwriting was like a window into his mind, and what we saw there was heartbreaking. It helped us understand that Kurt was sicker than any of us realized. Matley's analysis also had implications for how we understand Kurt's legacy and the circumstances of his death. The handwriting evidence provided strong support for the conclusion that Kurt had indeed taken his own life, and that his death was the result of severe, untreated mental illness rather than external circumstances. The handwriting evidence doesn't resolve all the questions about Kurt's death, but it does provide clear evidence of his psychological state in his final months. Matley noted, "He was clearly a man in crisis who needed help that he never received. The tragedy is that the warning signs were there, written in his own hand, but no one knew how to read them." The handwriting analysis also revealed the tragic irony of Kurt's situation. Even as his mental state was deteriorating, he continued to write prolifically, producing song lyrics, letters, and journal entries right up until his death. Writing seemed to be both his lifeline and his torment. Writing seemed to be both Kurt's salvation and his curse, Matley observed. It was how he expressed his pain, but it was also a record of his psychological decline. Every document he created in his final months was a cry for help, but it was written in a language that no one around him could understand. The analysis also showed that Kurt's handwriting problems had actually begun much earlier than his final months, but had accelerated dramatically looking at documents from 1993. Matley could see subtle signs of the deterioration that would become so pronounced in his final months. This wasn't a sudden breakdown, Matley explained. Kurt had been struggling for at least a year before his death, but the problems had been gradually getting worse. By 1994, the deterioration had reached a critical point where his basic cognitive functions were being affected. Marcel Matley's analysis of Kurt Cobain's handwriting remains one of the most comprehensive psychological profiles ever compiled of the grunge icon's final months. The evidence contained in Kurt's own handwriting provided a devastating portrait of a man whose mind was disintegrating in real time. The handwriting analysis served as a stark reminder of the importance of recognizing and treating mental illness, especially among creative individuals who may be reluctant to seek help or may not recognize the severity of their own condition. For fans and family members still struggling to understand Kurt's death, Matley's analysis provided both closure and heartbreak. The evidence was clear that Kurt had been suffering far more than anyone had realized, and that his death was the tragic result of untreated psychological crisis that had been building for months. Kurt's handwriting told us everything we needed to know about his final months, Matley concluded. He was a man in pain who couldn't find a way out of his suffering. His death was a tragedy that might have been prevented if someone had recognized the warning signs and known how to interpret them. The analysis also highlighted the need for better mental health awareness and intervention, particularly for artists and creative individuals who may be at higher risk for psychological problems. Kurt's story became a cautionary tale about the importance of taking mental health seriously and seeking help before a crisis reaches a critical point. Kurt's handwriting was screaming for help, but it was screaming in a language that no one around him could understand, Matley reflected years later. If we can learn to recognize these warning signs earlier, perhaps we can prevent other tragedies like this from happening. If this heartbreaking analysis of Kurt's final months moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the importance of mental health awareness. Have you ever noticed changes in your own or someone else's handwriting during difficult times? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible insights into the human stories behind music's greatest tragedy.